Hello, I'm Helen Allett from LSTM. In this lecture, we're going to think about providing effective feedback in the context of mentorship. So in our learning outcomes, we want to define and understand what we mean by feedback, to discuss the importance of feedback in the context of mentorship, to discuss what it is that makes feedback effective, and to discuss and describe different techniques for providing feedback. So first of all, what is feedback? Although feedback may be considered as sharing information, it is actually a two-way process because there's always going to be a reaction to that sharing and a further discussion. But basically, the mentor is sharing information with the mentee, and this might be based upon observation of clinical practice, and that has the aim of reaching a goal that's defined by going through the feedback process. And that goal should really be about raising performance level or helping the mentee to perform even better than they already do. And because of that, feedback should always be constructive. It's never meant to be a critical thing. It's something that we're doing constructively to help people improve. So why do you think that feedback is important? Why should we invest time in providing feedback? We need to think about the consequences of not having feedback, I suppose, as well. So feedback encourages reflection and self-awareness. So people may not always be aware of the effect that they have in situations and on people. And when feedback is given, it may then encourage that reflection and self-awareness. And that can then lead to a positive behaviour change. It can motivate staff and improve their morale. And that can lead to improved quality of care. Feedback can also serve as a challenge to bad behaviour or bad practice. But that should then lead us to develop the right or desired attitude or performance. So you can see from all these things how important feedback is and what we might miss if we didn't have feedback. So this is a useful model to help us remember the features of effective feedback. So feedback should be balanced, so it should focus on the strengths and the good things as well as the areas that need improvement. And we can think about that in the context of a feedback sandwich, which I'll describe next. Feedback should be observed, so it should be based upon what you've seen and how what you saw made you feel. So it's not based on hearsay, it's on observed practice. It needs to be objective, so it needs to be based on facts of what people have said and done. And so you must be able to give examples when you're giving feedback. And for that to be the case, it needs to be specific. So you should avoid generalizing and focus on specific points. So avoid saying things like, well, you always do this, because probably they don't always do it. And it's good to have that specific focus to be able to give those clear examples and be objective about the facts. And also, finally, timely. So the sooner the better, really, with feedback. Whilst the situation is fresh in everybody's memory, then feedback should be given in good time, because there's no good feeding back to somebody about a situation that they might have forgotten all about. So to give feedback, there's a few techniques that are quite useful to employ. First of all, the feedback sandwich. So that means sort of sandwiching the areas for improvement between positives about the situation. So you're feeding back the mentee about something they did well, and then discussing a facet that they need to improve, and then ending up with a further positive statement. So in that's a good way to make people help people to be more receptive to areas where they need to improve. If if we don't just tell them the things that need improving, but also the things that were done well. And then stop, start, continue. So this is another very useful model. So you can suggest to people some of the things that they should perhaps stop doing that they are doing, some of the things that they need to start doing, and then the things that they're doing right that they should continue to do. And this is a very useful reflective model for feedback. And finally, the SBIA approach, which takes in the situation, the behavior, the impact of that behavior, and then the actions that are needed. So those are just 3 different feedback techniques that you can think about using, and some might seem more appropriate for some situations and others for different situations. But the key thing about feedback is that it doesn't have to be just given by the mentor, but the mentor can encourage the mentee to generate feedback for themselves and to think about feeding back to themselves about what they've done and said. So you can ask people to reflect and generate their own feedback by using certain questions which can be helpful. So if you're asking somebody to think about a situation, you could say, well, what would good look like in that situation, or how would handling that situation well be different from now? What would be the difference be? So that you can mutually acknowledge and agree the desired standards that you would be aiming for. You can ask the mentee perhaps to self-rate their performance against those desired and agreed standards, so that they can think, well, did I meet up to the standard, or did I fall short, and in what ways do I need to change? And then they can make a plan, and if you ask the mentee to suggest ideas as to how they could bring their current performance up to the desired standard, that might be a good way to take things forward, because if they think of it themselves, they're perhaps more likely to want to do it. So the best feedback will always be constructive and have an element of self-generation by the mentee and be descriptive and factual. So the advantages of getting the mentee to self-generate their own feedback is that they will be less defensive if they're critiquing their own performance than if somebody else critiques it. They're also more likely to remember it, and this will encourage them to develop insight into their behaviors and actions. And they will eventually start to generate feedback to themselves in real time and on an ongoing basis. Descriptive feedback will contain rich information to aid improvement, so it will be detailed. It will not just be a kind of gloss over, well, you did that very well, without any form of analysis. We need to think, well, if that went well, why did it go well? What were the features that made it good? So we break things down and analyze the results and look at the effects of actions that have been taken. And also think about the degree to which the current level of performance is reaching the goal of that ideal standard of behavior and performance. And evaluate the current performance against that clear standard of excellence. So descriptive feedback will be detailed and will help the mentee to think on about how they can reach the standard that you've both agreed is desirable. So this little diagram I find very useful and it just shows us how we can think about support on one axis and challenge on another. So if you have a mentor who is not being very supportive and not being very challenging, then the mentee will probably be quite apathetic and will not care. If you have a lot of support but no challenge, then the mentee may become complacent and may think, well, I'm nothing to do, I'm doing everything really well, I'm fine, don't need to change. If, on the other hand, you have a lot of challenge and not much support, then it's likely that the mentee will become very stressed and may have sort of ongoing feelings of being a failure and not being able to cope. So in order to avoid both complacency, apathy and stress, we need to think about having a really good balance of support and challenge, and that is what is going to lead to growth and improvement. So thinking about maximising both support and challenge when it comes to feedback to mentees. So we thought about why feedback is so important. We've had some consideration of some useful techniques that we can employ when we're providing feedback, and we thought in particular about the value of self-generated feedback, and we're going to think a bit more in the live sessions about some scenarios where we could put this into practice and then think about the key points that we learn from that. So thank you very much for listening to this talk about feedback.